Welcome to Sunday service. I'm so happy you joined us. Hello.
Well, that's what I wondered, and I wondered if that day your typical program was 45. And I was wondering if she could, 30.
And that's what she was like.
Be accessible.
And she's like,
I'll give you a card. Sounds good.
yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. The original shorter, but we can work my numbers.
Yeah, great.
I'll pull it together with my environmental.
We need something to stir up the
The other piece, he would like his environmental.
Isn't that fun? Oh, yeah, No. Obviously.
All we can say is what's right.
Anything.
That's what I think that's right.
Always a little. You. Oh, and we're on tape. Did you? Yeah.
Now we gotta get the press out. But anyway, would you like to be our meeting? I would love
Okay, now I'm gonna sit still. Thank you. I've been at this spring. I love that. You know, I don't mind I believe 3 at once, but it's just, but you do it just like the dude on the corner of Upton Summit. I don't know if I can understand, see how better, but now it's just here's my mom-in-law. Hi, Peggy.
Good to see
And
you.
you.
Had a wonderful time. This is a great trip.
What a great way to spend January. All in fresh air. Right. In British Columbia.
Sounds
I think
perfect.
it'll be the new normal. As long as there aren't big events going on in January.
Yay, you're in the frame. All right, we're good.
Oh, yes, sure.
Oh, okay.
Good morning. And welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Door County. My name is Carrie Link, and as a member and on behalf of this fellowship, I welcome each and every one of you, and those of you who are here online. Thank you, Beth, for the opening music. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones so that we can enjoy this morning's service. This morning, as a way of welcoming, I'd like to quote these words by Kathleen McTeague. We come together this morning to remind one another to rest for a moment on the forming edge of our lives, to resist the headlong tumble into the next moment until we claim for ourselves awareness and gratitude and hope, taking the time to look into one another's faces and to see their communion, the reflection of our own eyes. This house of laughter and silence, memory and hope is hallowed by our presence together. We welcome all and thank all of you who found the time to be here this morning, and as I said, online. I'm wondering if there are any visitors here this morning or anyone who hasn't been here for a while. And if you're comfortable doing so, we invite you to stand, introduce yourselves, tell us where you're from, and what brought you here this morning. So, do we have any visitors? Yes. Would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Holly Cole. I'm from Sebastopol, and I'm here today to listen to your fantastic speaker.
Oh, great, thank you.
My name is Nancy Egger. I'm from Sturgeon Bay, and I'm Holly's sister, and also to hear the fantastic speaker. So, no more pressure.
Thank you.
And I'm
Go ahead.
Ann Kinzer, and I'm from Berlin, Wisconsin. And this is my friend, Gail. Her does very well. Yeah, I mean, she can talk. Yeah, no. Anyway, and it's kind of a twofer for me, because, well, three, because one, I've been always curious about space. Two, wanted to come to see you. And three is that it's not really our birthday. Your birthday is in June, but we finally got away for like our birthday. So it's like, this is like a trifecta.
Oh, great, thank you, welcome. Go ahead.
I'm Chuck Gress from Egg Harbor in Northbrook, Illinois. Some of you may know my daughters, Kelly Goodness and Lauren Ward.
Very nice, thank you.
Gary Sugarline from Sister Bay. I drove all the way out here.
I'm glad you made the trip.
I'm Reverend Hope Bissett. I'm a minister and hospice chaplain in Appleton, Wisconsin, and retiring shortly from over 20-some years of hospital and chaplaincy work. I had no idea that we were having such a well-known speaker today. Because I love Emerson, and this is my partner, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Anne Marie, live in Appleton with Hope, and a retired elementary school teacher.
Very nice, very nice. Welcome all of you. And I hope you have signed the guest book. And if anyone would like to know more about Unitarian Universalism in general, or our fellowship in particular, please feel free to ask any of us. There's also printed information in the foyer, as well as visiting our website, uufdc.org. It doesn't work well when your lips are sticking together. We invite everyone to gather for coffee and conversation in the gathering room immediately following the postlude. And then when the chimes sound, we will gather back in here over in this area for a talk back with our speaker. And that's a good segue into introducing our speaker, Fred, better known as Doc Heidi. You've all had the chance to read the amazing bio on the front of your order of service. And I'm not sure he realizes this, although we've now discussed it, but we are neighbors. He lives just down the road from me, but I don't think he remembers that I used to work at Espresso Lane, slinging coffee and whatnot, and he would stop in after jogging many miles and ask for an espresso or a latte or I don't know what, but I was always surprised he didn't want a gallon of water. The announcements pertaining to the order or to UUFDC are printed on the back of your order of service. But if there is anyone who has another announcement that they would like to make, Cindy Nelson will bring the microphone to you. And please say your name first.
I'm Trish Black, representing the Caring Committee this morning, and this Friday we have our first quarterly brunch celebration for birthdays. Anybody who's having a birthday the first quarter, we are honoring, but especially honoring our octogenarians, which we have a few in that group. And it's just a time to elevate those people who have achieved that milestone. It is not a gift given to everybody, and a chance to celebrate them and to dig into that deep well of wisdom that they have to give each and every one of us. So all that said, we need you to sign up, UUFDC Caring Committee at gmail.com. And we need sign up by tomorrow so we can have enough food. So please do so if you plan to attend.
Thank you, Trish.
Hi, Bob Boltman. Just want to encourage everybody, if you haven't had a chance to check out the current exhibit at the Miller Art Museum in Sturgeon Bay. They're really pushing the boundaries of what Miller has done, and I really hope we can encourage that. It's a very visceral look at farming life. So also not maybe your typical, not the cute little red barn on the hill, paintings that are going on there right now. And just in general, there's the county and the city have supported the Miller for a really long time, and there's an ongoing conversation about that relationship changing. So if you care about the Miller, I encourage you to reach out and at least be vocal in the community about it. Thanks.
If you were here last week, you heard this announcement then. For those of you that are as outraged as I am about the continuing mass shootings and gun violence in our country, if you haven't signed and written your postcard yet to your politicians, they're scattered around the coffee table this morning as well as on the counter. Please, please take them and get your word out there.
Hi, I'm Mark Richards. Just in case you don't get enough this morning, I will be preaching at the Meadows at Scandia for the next 4 weeks, at 1 o'clock on Sunday afternoons. And you're all welcome.
Thank you, Mark.
Well, I'm Cindy Nelson, and I have 2 announcements. One is Tuesday afternoons are fun at UUFDC. So from 1 to 4 in the month of February, on Tuesday afternoons, we are going to be playing games and doing puzzles and whatever else you would like to do to have some enjoyment in these winter days. So we will have numerous games and puzzles available, but if you have a favorite, feel free to bring it. And also, no, I'm not. And also bring your own drinks and snacks to share. So 1 to 4, starting this Tuesday, every Tuesday in February. My second announcement has to do with the nominating committee. Karen Studebaker, way over there, and I are the committee this year. As you know, this is the time of the year that we will be reaching out to folks to see if they would like to serve in some capacity at UUFDC. We try to send you an email first so that we don't blindside you, that you have some time to think about it, and we will follow up with a phone call or a visit in person. But do keep in mind that this is a community of volunteers and that there are many ways that you can help serve. You all have a lot of talent. And so if you get that email or if you get that phone call, please consider it and help us continue this fellowship.
Thank you, Cindy. We will now begin this morning's service with the lighting of the chalice and these words by Albert Thielander. We hallow this time together by kindling the lamp of our heritage. Today being the first Sunday of the month, we take time to illuminate one of our 7 principles. The 7th principle states, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, which means to me, we need one another. We need one another when we mourn and would be comforted. We need one another when we are in trouble and afraid. We need one another when we are in despair, in temptation, and need to be recalled to our best selves again. We need one another when we accomplish some great purpose and cannot do it alone. We need one another in the hour of success when we look for someone to share our triumphs. We need one another in the hour of defeat when, with encouragement, we might endure and stand again. We need one another when we come to die and would have gentle hands prepare us for the journey. All our lives we are in need, and others are in need of us. Please rise as you are able in body or spirit for hymn number 83, and then remain standing for the unison affirmation and the doxology. We gather together to seek knowledge and wisdom, to explore freely the vast reaches of mind and spirit, to celebrate within the caring community those truths, ancient and modern, which give meaning and direction to our lives. Please be seated. Now is the time for joys and concerns, a time in which you might like to share something that has made you happy and or something which has given you concern. And please remember that our service is live and being recorded. So if your joy or concern involves another person, make sure you have that person's permission. And again, Cindy will bring the microphone to you.
Hi, Nora Flood. I'm sure many of you know Joni Witalison from A Cut Above in Fish Creek. Joni had a heart attack a few weeks ago, and the 2 stents put in didn't work well. So she's going in for open heart surgery tomorrow morning to have her aortic valve replaced. And there's been a GoFundMe site set up for her on her Facebook page, and you can also donate at Nicolay Bank in Egg Harbor, or you could stop at the salon, and Jessica is accepting funds for her and her family at the salon. So channel all of your light and positive energy tomorrow morning for Joni. She's at Freighter in Milwaukee.
Good morning.
Hey, Jackie.
I'm Jackie Polton. I've been a member since 2004, but it's been 1.5 years since I've been able to be with you. I'm so grateful for this congregation. I feel like this is my home. Last April, my husband Donald was diagnosed with terminal cancer and entered hospice care at home. And I was able to care for him until 6 days before he passed in September. So it's been a difficult time. But knowing that this congregation is here and that I would come back and receive so many hugs and smiles has meant everything. Thank you.
We're glad you're here, Jackie.
So I want to voice a concern about the month of January, beginning with the murder of Tyree Nichols, continuing with 40 mass shootings in 31 days. I think it's time we pause to reflect on how violence becomes so foundational to our culture.
We will now have this morning's offering, which will be given and received in grateful appreciation of our shared hopes and values. We will now take a moment to silence our busy thoughts and to appreciate our peaceful surroundings. May each one of our thoughts help bring peace to the world. And now, Doc.
Well, good morning to all of you. Thank you so much for inviting me back to address your wonderful group. It's always such a pleasure to talk to folks who are so open-minded and intelligent and interested in deep topics. So I'm very honored to be invited back. Every time I've been asked to address the Unitarians, I always want to learn a little bit more about Unitarianism before I come. So I consult the world's most accurate source of information, the internet, where I read, what do you get when you put two Unitarians together? 3 opinions. Why do Unitarians have trouble singing in choirs? Because they're always reading ahead to see if they agree with the next verse. Also heard a story about a Unitarian family that moved into a small town, and they had a little girl, and she was becoming friends with the next door neighbor girl. And the neighbor girl said, "Oh, we're Episcopalians, what are you?" And the Unitarian girl said, "I think we are League of Women Voters." So, however you define yourself as Unitarians or League of Women Voters or whatever else it might be, I'm very glad to be here. Today I'm going to speak about something that, as far as I know, I have never addressed publicly before in my whole life, actually. So it's the roots of my own spiritual worldview, which formed in my early childhood. I'll be telling you about that. And when I was asked to speak here, of course, we're always asked what topic we're going to talk about. And I thought this might be interesting, even though I've never addressed it before, or maybe because I've never addressed it before, for several reasons. First of all, I thought it was possible that, like me, you find it interesting as to how people come up with their fundamental convictions about the nature of life. I find this, at least as interesting as talking about whether Aaron Rodgers is going to retire or, all the things we tend to talk about instead. And there are very few forums to talk about these things. Outside the Unitarian Fellowship, I guess there's, late night discussions in your college dorm room during freshman year. People get into these things, but typically there is not a situation where this is appropriate. The second reason is I thought it could potentially be helpful for me to share my own experience. Because whether one is struggling to figure out one's spiritual attitude or whether one has firm spiritual convictions, I think it can still be useful to put that in the context of other people's experience around that. So I thought that could be helpful. And the third reason is I have a strong suspicion, I can't demonstrate this empirically, but I have a strong suspicion that the root of spiritual conviction is experiential rather than conceptual, okay? I think this is what Emerson was talking about when he talked about us having an original relation with the universe. I'm going to come back to Emerson a little later in my talk, and if I forget to do that, please someone hold up your hand and say Emerson, because I do have a few things to say about him. I'm going to skip over him for the moment, though, and talk instead about William James for a minute, who was the brilliant founder of my field of psychology. He's considered the founder of American psychology, and also a major philosopher. And it's not widely known that the people who founded American psychology, including William James, had a great interest in spiritual topics and the existence of another world and psychic communication and all this kind of stuff. And a lot of the early research at the late 19th century in what we now call psychology concerned that topic. William James's most famous book, I think, gives us a clue to the point I was just trying to make, because it's called The Varieties of Religious Experience. It was published in, I think, 1902. It's still widely read. Some of you might have come across it in a philosophy class in college. And I just read it fairly recently in the last year or two, and I was astonished to see how contemporary it still was. And there's some things that are outdated, but so much of it still had resonance. And I think it's significant that he named the book The Varieties of Religious Experience, not the varieties of religious conceptualization or theological speculation or something else. What James argues in that book, and this, as I say, is also my impression, is that strongly held spiritual convictions arise from experience. And I think that's true historically and prehistorically. I don't think our ancestors sat around, discussing Wittgenstein or Hegel or something. Of course, those people weren't alive then. I don't think they arrived at their convictions through conceptualization. I think they arrived at them through lived experience, and I'll talk about that again a little bit later in the talk. And this particular book by William James is actually a description of a number of experiences that famous and not so famous people had that led them to a spiritual worldview. Tolstoy and John Calvin, and St. Teresa, and so on. He describes this all as a psychologist, which is to say he's trying to be neutral and open-minded about this, which is not the attitude that my field of psychology has historically had toward spiritual and religious conviction. Very early on, about the same time, actually the year prior to James, 2 years prior to publishing this, Sigmund Freud wrote The Interpretation of Dreams and launched an entire career in which he challenged the notion that religious conviction or spiritual experience was legitimate. Famously wrote a book arguing that our belief in God is basically a projection, and our strong need for a father figure in the sky leads to our belief in these things. So there have been multiple attempts in psychology to kind of explain this stuff away. And it wasn't actually until the very end of the 20th century, the very early part of our current century, that psychology began to embrace the legitimacy of religious variation and include that in psychotherapeutic intervention and so on. It was, for a long time, not much discussed. And if you look at surveys around this, people in my field of psychology actually have a much lower rate of belief in spiritual topics than the general public or people from other sciences. And I suspect that's true because we as psychologists are trained in rigorous research methodology, and it makes us skeptical of claims in the spiritual realm, which oftentimes are extremely difficult to validate. So it's not particularly surprising that a lot of the folks I worked with for close to 40 years in California, were very skeptical about this realm. They were atheistic or agnostic or not part of any kind of ongoing spiritual practice. So, nevertheless, William James, at the very beginning of the field, had a different attitude and took this stuff at face value. If people argued that they had a fundamental experience that transformed their life, he wanted to know what that was and why that was important. So he actually defines, I'm going to read just a couple brief quotes from him. I think it's so brilliant. Religion consists of the belief that there is an unseen order and that our supreme good lies in harmoniously adjusting ourselves thereto. Now, I think that's actually a better definition of spirituality than it is of religion. That's another topic. Religion involves all sorts of structures that are embedded in society and various practices that vary across cultural groups. But I think it is true that spirituality often involves a sense of an unseen order and an attempt to adjust oneself harmoniously to it. It is as if there were in the human consciousness, James writes, a sense of reality, a feeling of objective presence, a perception of what we may call something there, more deep and more general than any of the special and particular senses by which current psychology supposes existent realities to be originally revealed. That's a little bit dense. What he's saying is there is in human psychology a sense of something out there that is just as strong as our sense of things that we experience through sight or sound or hearing or taste. These feelings of reality are as convincing to those who have them as any direct sensible experiences can be, and they are, as a rule, much more convincing than results established by mere logic ever are. Okay? So, again, he's saying, if you have these experiences, they're very convincing to you. They may not be convincing to your cousin when you describe them to them, but if you've had them, they're as convincing to you as any normal experience we have with the other senses. And he's also arguing that basically the logical justification of this comes after the experience. The truth is that in the metaphysical and religious sphere, articulate reasons are cogent for us only when our inarticulate feelings of reality have already been impressed in favor of the same conclusion. So he's saying we have these so-called inarticulate feelings of reality that I'm going to be describing to you today on my own, and they're more, and then we only develop articulate reasons for that in the wake of having them. Okay, so I could stand up here and talk to you, and to some extent in past lectures here, I have talked to you about, scientific reasons to believe that spiritual issues are legitimate, and I think a strong argument could be made for that. But the reason I've tried to think that through in my life is because I began by having inarticulate feelings of spiritual reality when I was a very small child. And so that interested me profoundly. It ended up shaping my entire professional life. I became a psychologist because of that. I can tell you a little bit more about that. In my work in Northern Sky Theater, that some of you might be familiar with, you probably know that every show I've ever written contains a spiritual theme. I'm not interested in writing simple entertainments. I don't object to them. I enjoy them. But when I write something, I want it to be about something, and it always ends up coming back to being on some spiritual theme, because I am continually moved by the fact that I had these experiences early in my life and then subsequent to that. So anyway, so I think for all those reasons, I thought maybe you would be interested in hearing a bit about this, and I hope you are. Because if you're not, you're in trouble. I'm going to be talking about them for the next few minutes, and that's just the way it is. So it's impossible for me to describe my spiritual worldview without starting with the fact that I was raised in a devout Episcopalian household. Okay, and when I talk about this, I often say that I think the words devout Episcopalian are kind of oxymorons. You know, a lot of people who become Episcopalians do so for reasons other than their strong belief, it seems to me. You know, the Episcopalian Church is the church of presidents, starting with George Washington. You know, lots of our presidents have gone to the Episcopalian Church. The National Cathedral in Washington is an Episcopal cathedral, and so on. So, and there's at least a couple of varieties of Episcopal Church. There's the High Church, which involves more singing and incense and that kind of stuff, and the Low Church, which is a little more less frilly. Well, I grew up in the High Church in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. The first 8 years of my life were in Stevens Point, which is, if you know what, it's a little paper mill town in the Wisconsin River. My dad was a social work administrator. My mom was a 1950s housewife trying her best to raise me and my older brother. And she was a devout Episcopalian. She was really into it. And as a small child, I was very struck because, first of all, we went to church all the time. The church was maybe 5-6 blocks from our house, so we could actually walk there on Sunday morning. But we were not content just to go on Sunday because there were also Wednesday night church suppers, and you'd go and you'd have mass, and then we'd all get together and have tuna noodle casserole. This was back in the days when smoking was popular, and you could barely see the people across the table for all the clouds of tobacco smoke. And there were also Friday evening vespers, which didn't involve mass, but did involve a trip to the church. So I would go with my mom to that too. So 2 or 3 times a week throughout my childhood, I was going to the Episcopal Church in downtown Stevens Point, Wisconsin, which is a beautiful building. A few years ago, it was sold because of structural problems, but at this point, I think it's like 100 years old, made out of stone, gorgeous stained glass windows. And we would sit down in the front pew, and my mom would, what you do in an Episcopal service, as you probably know, it's almost identical to a Catholic service. You're standing up reciting prayers, or sitting down reciting prayers, or occasionally kneeling and reciting prayers, and then once in a while you sing a beautiful song. And we were fortunate in the Episcopal Church that our hymnal had been orchestrated by Ralph Vaughan Williams, the great British composer. So that was some of my first exposure to English folk tunes that he'd incorporated in his melodies for these hymns. Anyway, so the singing was wonderful, and the building was gorgeous, and the windows were spectacular. But beyond that, I was having a hard time as a small child figuring out why we were doing this. Because it felt to me like all we were doing was talking, repeating prayers that had been written by someone else, or listening to the priest deliver a sermon. And as I would look around the church, and again, I'm little at this point, this was all, we moved when I was 8 years old, so I know it has to be before I was 8. I'd look around, and the other people in the service looked dull, or like they were just doing it because they were supposed to be there on Sunday, or they could hardly wait for church to get out so they could go watch the Packers, or whatever it might be. It didn't feel like there was, it didn't appear to me, on their faces at least, that they were deeply involved in it, whereas my mother had this sense of ecstasy upon her face. And that was frankly uncomfortable to me as a small kid, because I was like the only kid who had a mother who was really into the church. And of course, the message of the life of Jesus was beautiful and inspiring. But what was missing, it seemed to me, was any kind of spiritual experience there. My mom actually became so devoted to this that she devoted much of her life to trying to write up the sermons of our parish priest in Stevens Point, Father Edward Lewis. He was very articulate and intelligent and well-educated, like many Episcopalian priests are. And so she spent decades trying to formulate this into a coherent theological vision based on his sermons and never succeeded in doing that, unfortunately. But that was kind of the heart of what motivated her in life, in addition to family and all the things we all share. So I was confused by this. I knew there was something happening to her, and it seemed like there was thousands of years of tradition of people being into this for some reason, but it felt to me that is it just a set of moral prescriptions about needing to behave in loving ways? That's obviously extremely important, and the behavioral aspects of spirituality are very important, but is there something else that's missing? So, I think it was an Easter weekend, my mother invited us to go to my brother and I, she invited, to drive down to Fond du Lac to the Episcopal Cathedral in our diocese. And I was very excited about this because I'd read about cathedrals and seen pictures of them in books and thought it was going to be like Notre Dame, and of course, it was nowhere near that glorious. It was in Fond du Lac. And, it was bigger than our church, but there was not much else going on in terms of the scale of the building. But I went and my brother went. My brother what we were supposed to do for this day was have a quiet day, which is to say we were supposed to spend the day just being silent, which, is a rare enough thing. And we were allowed to go to the library to read if we wanted to, or sit by ourselves in the garden or whatever it might be. And I decided the thing to do was to go into the cathedral. And it was a little surprising, since people would come from all over the state or all over our diocese to this thing, that no one else was in the cathedral on the Episcopal Quiet Day, which again is kind of a statement, I think, about how a lot of people approach this topic. They were off reading the Bible or something like that, but they were not in the actual space. So I had several hours there to just hang out by myself in the cathedral. And I remember sitting in the pew, I remember going around and looking at the carved Stations of the Cross, and contemplating them. And I think this was probably the first time in my life in which I had ever intentionally tried to observe, I don't know what to call it, spiritual presence. I was just sitting there wondering what was going on. And rather than thinking about it or reading about it, I was trying to just experience it. And by the end of that day, I had felt something. An experience that I found profoundly moving. I had quieted down. I felt a sense of presence that is, as William James and many other people have talked about, pretty much impossible to describe. One of my graduate school professors used to say, "You cannot F the ineffable." Nevertheless, that's what we try to do in psychology all the time, because the nature of psychology is it's about invisible things, and we're constantly trying to describe things that are hard to describe. It's extremely difficult to describe this experience. If you've had it, you will recognize it, and if you haven't had it, it's hard to put it into words. There's a sense of comfort in it. There's a sense that everything is fundamentally okay in the universe. There's a sense of peace in it. There's, in its more extreme forms, you can actually experience it as a physical sensation, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But I was getting the first taste of this that day when I was 7 or 8 years old. And I remember driving back to Stevens Point afterward. My brother was rambunctious, as he often was, and my mom's pissed off because my brother is unwilling to sit still. And I was just sitting there in this cone of silence, feeling like I discovered something fundamental, that I had a doorway into the infinite. And when we got back home, of course, we were going to church all the time, right? So the next time we went to church and, everyone goes to the service, the same thing, nothing, everyone let her talk, everyone goes out, they had breakfast, and I snuck back into the church. These were the years when they didn't lock churches, which I think is one of the great American tragedies and one of the results of what you were talking about earlier, that we now lock churches, right? It used to just be able to go and hang out at a church. So I started doing this repeatedly. I would go after Sunday morning service or after the Wednesday evening tuna casserole dinners, whatever. I would go and just sit in the church trying to experience that again. And if you've attempted this yourself, it's not easy to do. And over the years, through my experience in psychology, I've discovered the reason for that is that your brain is designed to generate random thoughts by something in your brain called the default mode network. So we are constantly having mental chatter that is going on pretty much all our waking hours, unless we try to do something to rein that in. So we're constantly thinking about, Doc's droning on. I wonder if he's going to get the point. Gosh, where should we go for breakfast this morning? Is Al Johnson's open? Oh, it might be too crowded. I don't know. Oh, there's no football. Oh, gosh, what am I going to do this afternoon? The Packers aren't playing. Blah, 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 blah. Our minds are racing like this all the time with this kind of discursive chatter, right? And it takes the form of words and also mental images, and we're thinking about the past and ruminating about stupid things we did, or projecting ourselves into next week and all the stuff we have to get done. And so we're not simply noticing what's going on in front of our eyes most of the time, unless we engage in a specific spiritual practice, right? So it's not surprising that it was a little hard to do this, but I'm here to tell you I did feel it. It was in that church in Stevens Point. And in fact, one time I remember going down to the basement and I could feel it in the basement. And I will also say there is in this experience a sense of, that again has been described in the theological literature as kind of a sense of awe, and it's just slightly frightening. There's something about it that feels like I've tapped into something that's, I don't really know what this is. It feels, as I say, on the one hand, very safe and encompassing and warm. And on the other hand, it feels grand and indefinable. So that's the launch of my spiritual inquiry. And I got really interested in this and that. Then as a small kid, you're probably not surprised to hear I was an unusual child, right? So the other kids all wanted to play basketball or something, and I would literally go and sit on the stoop outside the church and try to experience the divine. I was, an introvert and very interested in this, and really wanted to get back to that experience. Because I was a smart kid, they invited me to join the class at my church on what was called dogmatic theology. It was all adults in the room, and it was supposed to be kind of an advanced exposition of Episcopalian theology. And I'm here to tell you my first problem with it, and I did go. At that time, I was actually thinking of becoming an Episcopalian priest because I thought, well, how do you pursue this thing? I guess, you become an Episcopalian priest. That's, if you're really interested in spirituality. So as I say, my first problem with it was called dogmatic theology, which I would offer to you as another oxymoron. Dogmatic theology is defined as a set of principles laid down by an authority as incontrovertibly true. And I think it's hard to think of a realm of human experience about which we'd want to be less dogmatic than theology. There's enormous theological variation around the world and across cultures and so on. So the notion that the Episcopal Church knew everything and they were going to transmit it to these folks through this class struck me as suspect. So I felt uncomfortable with that. And I remember a conversation that happened. There was a DJ in Green Bay called Rick Witt. He was on a show called a radio station called WDUZ, and he was one of the DJs there. He had joined our church. He was kind of a celebrity in town, and he was in this class. And I remember him having these theological debates with our priest, who was very articulate. And Rick was saying, well, can't I experience a spiritual presence in nature? Why do I have to come to a service where all you're doing is talking? And the priest successfully argued him out of that position. And I did not speak up because I figured he'd probably try to argue me out of that position too. And I wasn't articulate enough to defend my view that you did not necessarily have to be in a church in order to experience spiritual presence. You can. And I find it really interesting to go to churches and seek that out around the world. But that's not the only place this presence exists. So I was wondering what to do. I go off to college, and I had a good friend from high school. We both went to Madison together. And about this time, he introduced me to the writings of Jiddu Krishnamurti. I don't know if any of you know Krishnamurti. He was an Indian, I don't know what to call him, spiritual thinker, who, as a child, demonstrated a lot of spiritual perspicacity, and he was taken on by the Theosophical Society of America, and they thought he was going to be the next world leader, kind of the incarnation of Buddha in our generation. And at a young age, he said, nope, I'm not going to do that. I am not the enlightened one to tell you what's going on. You must all go forth and figure it out on your own. And in this way, I think he was doing the very same thing that the Buddha did. On the last day of the Buddha's life, he was quoted as saying, do not believe what you read in books. Do not believe what your teachers tell you. Be lamps unto yourselves. Seek out your own spiritual destiny. Got the last part of that wrong. But the Buddha himself was saying, figure it out. And Krishnamurti was saying this, figure it out. And in fact, Krishnamurti was so down on the notion that we would follow an authority in the spiritual realm that he didn't even want to teach meditation. Because he said, well, then you'll be just following some technique that somebody else came up with. Figure it out on your own. Well, up to this point, as I was describing to you, I had been kind of figuring it out on my own. I was going there, trying to feel the spiritual presence. Now I go off to college, and I'm starting to get interested in psychology, and a new book has come out by a guy named Charles Tart. He was a psychologist at the University of California at Davis, and the book was called Altered States of Consciousness. It was the first book to pull together research on this. And I was fortunate enough to have been selected to be in the Heritage Ensemble that summer. This is summer 1973. That, of course, changed my life, as you know. This is my 50th year of performing with that same group. I really liked it. I stayed with it. Anyway, this was our first summer there. And back, so this is, I'm sophomore in college. I had free time. I didn't have things I had to do. We were staying in the Welker Mansion, which I don't know if they ever tore it down. It used to be on the top of the Fish Creek Bluff and overlooked the entire town. And there was a little room upstairs that no one else wanted to have because the mansion was thought to be haunted. It turns out there's some pretty good evidence the mansion was haunted. That's a story for another time. Anyway, so I got the room upstairs. And it was this tiny little room, and it had a closet that led into the innards of the house, and you didn't know what was back in there. But I got this new book by Charles Tart, and in it was an article, a chapter by a psychiatrist from Marin County called Arthur Dykman. And he had conducted the first study of what we now call concentrative meditation. What he had done was ask a bunch of his friends, who are mostly social workers and psychologists and psychiatrists in Marin County, fairly liberal group, to sit and stare at a blue vase. Doesn't sound particularly challenging. Turns out it really is. Look at a blue vase for half an hour. Don't try to think about the vase. Don't follow the stream of thoughts that come up for you when you are contemplating the vase. Instead, just try to see the vase as it is. And in this chapter, then he records the experiences of these normal folks, although I admit they were mental health professionals, so I don't know how normal they could really be. But putting that aside, these relatively, they weren't mystics or, Zen monks, they were just folks. And they described all these powerful experiences they were having staring at the blue vase. Well, I didn't have a blue vase, but I did have a really cool candle that was made of little pieces of wax, yellow and brown together. And so I would sit in my little room upstairs and stare at the candle. I don't know if you've ever had this experience in your life, and it's a complex experience. I'm not necessarily suggesting you do it, although some of you might find it of interest. If you try to stare at a blue vase or a candle or your hand, or it really doesn't matter what you stare at, and do it with concentrated attention for a period of time, more than a minute, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, weird things start happening. The shape, in this case, of the candle started changing, and the colors changed, and it would get dark, and it would get light, and it would seem like suddenly the entire room would get dark, and then the room would get light again. And these are, common experiences that people have when they do this. So you want to have some sense of grip on your, mental health if you're going to pursue this, I think. And I did this for a period of weeks, spending half an hour, 45 minutes a day, staring at this candle. And one day, I had this breakthrough in which all the crap in my mind, all the chatter, all the thoughts about everything that was going on, I finally was able to clear that away through this focus of mental attention and see the candle in all its glory. And it was like sort of throbbing with energy. And I thought, well, what's going on? And I remember getting up and walking out on the little road that leads from the Welker Mansion out to Highway 42. And the world was alive. The trees were glowing with energy. It was like the leaves had diamonds on the end of them, and they were just glittering with some sort of fundamental power. It was as if I had, taken a psychedelic drug or something. It was like, wow. And all I had been doing, it's not all I was doing. It took a huge amount of concentration to get to this point over a period of weeks, but it was done solely through mental concentration. So that was another big step on my spiritual conviction. Apparently, I learned through attentional methods, one can approach forms of perception that one doesn't have when one is stuck in verbal chatter. So, all sorts of things happened in the wake of that. I decided to go off to graduate school and study meditation. My master's and doctoral thesis were psychophysiological studies of meditators. I moved to California and had the opportunity to go up to the Sequoias, and soon discovered, and I'm putting all this out here. I don't know what you make of this. It's very easy, particularly as a psychologist, I recognize that there are all sorts of psychological phenomena that can account for experiences apart from the possibility that there is a spiritual dimension to the universe. There's expectancy effects and suggestion effects and all sorts of stuff that we try to eliminate in rigorous research. But what I came to find was, at least in my experience, that with the proper approach of quieting down the mind, one could, in the right context, experience this realm of spiritual presence, or whatever you want to call it, okay? Probably the most compelling examples of that came a little later in my life. I wrote a show with the great Paul Sills, founder of the Second City, that involved Native American folktales. And so I spent a lot of time in Anasazi ruins in the West. And I remember the first time I went there, it was with my good friend John Hansen, local potter who's since passed on. I went with him and his family, and we went to a kiva at the Bandelier National Monument. And kivas, as you probably know, are where the Anasazi, which means the old ones, the folks who came before the currently recognized First Nation people of the West, they would go into these kivas and have ceremonies, right? And song and dance and, praying to the gods. And so I was leaning against the wall of this kiva, and I felt this strong presence again. It's like the same thing, except even more powerful, almost like an electrical field. And I was really into it. I mean, it's like, wow, it's soothing. It feels right. It feels like everything's going to be okay. Whatever goes on, it's all okay. And I described this to John as we were leaving, and he was like, wow, that's pretty interesting. Got on the plane back to San Francisco, and the headline in that Sunday's San Francisco Chronicle was about hippies making pilgrimages to the Anasazi ruins of the West in order to experience spiritual energies. Now, again, as a psychologist, if you're trying to rule out expectancy effects, you don't want to go after you've read the article in the Chronicle. You go before any, even know that. So I had no idea that anyone ever went there seeking spiritual energies. We were just going to learn about the Anasazi. So to me, that was some kind of indication that something real was going on there. The final example of this I'll give you is when Fred Alley and I went to Haleakala National Park in Hawaii. Some of you were privileged to know the great Fred Alley. He was the co-founder of Northern Sky Theater, brilliant writer, on the verge of giant national breakthrough, had just written the Spitfire Grill, was supposed to be flying to New York City to get a $100,000 check from Stephen Sondheim to produce it off Broadway, and he had a heart attack while jogging near the home we owned together over near Bailey's Harbor, and he died at age 38. So Fred and I, one of our bonds was that we were both spiritual. He had grown up in a fundamentalist church in Mount Horeb and rejected all the hoopla around the fundamentalism, but he remained interested in spirituality. And as I've been telling you, I've been very interested in spirituality. So we went to Haleakala National Park. Again, we didn't really know much about this, except I had read that shamans used to go there as a training ground in this gargantuan, it's 12,000 feet high or something. I mean, it's really an impressive thing. If you ever have a chance to go, you enter from the top of it and go down into the volcano. And at one point we came upon a rock, and Fred and I leaned against this rock, and there was, the best way I could describe it is it was almost like a force field coming out of it. It felt like an electrical field, but at the same time like a warm bath. It was like, and if you closed your eyes, you could kind of see warm colors and blue, visions before your eyes and so on. I was like, wow, something is happening here. And after we both did that for a while, we talked to each other, and we had both experienced it. Again, we didn't expect it. He experienced it independently of me describing it to him and so on. There was something going on there. And so it wasn't surprising to learn that shamans had used this as a training ground. So I'm describing to you a whole series of outlandish experiences that, despite the fact that they might, I don't know how they sound to you, convincing or not, they form the basis of the rest of my life. I decided I wanted to pursue clinical psychology because I thought this is the most important thing I've ever experienced, and I want to study it. As I was saying before, when I do writing, I try to incorporate these things because I think they're so important. So I believe, as Jung said, paraphrase Carl Jung, the fundamental question for us is whether we're connected to the infinite or not. The fundamental question, he said, is whether we're connected to the infinite or not. Only if we know that the thing that truly matters is the infinite can we avoid fixing our interests upon futilities and upon kinds of goals that are not of real importance. Now, I believe it's entirely possible to live a good and moral life as a person, and I have many friends who do this who do not share my spiritual conviction. I don't think it's necessary, in other words, to have a spiritual conviction in order to live a good life. Lots of people do it without. And what I do think is that this is an important opportunity in our human experience to do this, and is extremely helpful. It has given me a lifelong sense of everything being fine. Of whatever happens, it's okay. And it contrasts in this way fairly strongly to what we might call a pure existentialist view. The view I actually had the opportunity to work with and study with some of the major American existential psychotherapists, Rollo May, James Vichenthal, and so on, who are not spiritual, but wanted to generate meaning outside of a spiritual context. And so that's how existentialism arises in France in the wake of World War II. And I know it's entirely possible to develop good values and live a good life and be a good person based on the assumption that there is no ultimate meaning to the universe. So this isn't necessary. On the other hand, it's extremely helpful, I think. It has been in my life. And to circle back around to Emerson for a second, I think Emerson recognized the importance of spiritual experience in his first major book, Nature, written in 1832, remarkably clear and accurate again. This is decades before the Civil War he's writing this. I just realized he actually wrote this book the same year he left the Unitarian Fellowship, which, because he was a little too liberal for the Unitarians. But the opening paragraph of his first book, Nature, describes this beautifully. Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers, Emerson writes. Let's see the rest of this. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. So what he's saying is, talking about the early 19th century in America, we're basing our spiritual philosophy on what we read in the Bible or read in early philosophers, Plato and so on. It's retrospective. Then he goes on to say something very profound. The foregoing generations, in other words, the generations who came before us, beheld God and nature face to face, but we through their eyes. Why should not we also enjoy an original relation with the universe? I think what Emerson is saying is our ancestors, the proto-humans that were successful enough that they survived and you're all here today, they beheld God and nature face to face, but we do it through their eyes. In other words, we read the Bible and try to figure it out, or read the words of Jesus and try to figure out what he's wanting us to do, or Buddha, whatever it might be, rather than having an original relation with the universe. So I believe it is our birthright to have an original relation with the universe. I believe anthropology reveals, this is too big a topic to go into today, we might talk about it some other time. Anthropology really reveals that every pre-modern society ever discovered on any continent in the world engages in ritualistic and shamanistic practices on a regular basis that organize their society and help to heal. These involve dancing and music and also, somewhat controversially, powerful mind-altering plants. Okay. In every society in the world in which there was a mind-altering plant available to be used, the peoples in that culture figured out somehow what it was and imbibed it and used it as a method of communing with alternate realities. If you're interested in this topic, there's a vast academic literature on it. We don't have to go into today. The point I'm raising here today is your ancestors all had experiences of what they would call the divine or spiritual or whatever it might be, depending on the society. And we also have that right. It's hard to do. It's getting harder all the time because we have so many distractions. Like me, you probably have an iPhone in your pocket. And, in a spare moment, isn't it fun to check and see what the Apple News feed is saying, or read your email, or look at texts from your grandkids, or whatever it might be. All sorts of things that they're engaging the rational thinking mind and not connecting you with this other dimension of reality. So I think it is possible to do this, but it's getting harder and harder to do. And as I say, that was one of the reasons why I wanted to share this with you this morning, to say, I think it is possible. I've experienced it. I found it very valuable. What you do with it is up to you. But perhaps it's helpful to know that someone in the community, has had some of these experiences and found them foundational. So I thought I would end with a little poem by Rilke, one of my favorite poets, that describes this whole quest I've been on and kind of summarizes it. I live my life in growing orbits that move out over the things of the world. Maybe I will not achieve the last, but that will be my attempt. I'm circling around God, around the great tower, and I've been circling for 1,000 years. And I still do not know if I am a falcon or a storm or a great song.
Thank you, Doug. Quite a bit to take in, think about. Please rise in body or spirit for hymn number 6. Please be seated. I will now extinguish the chalice with these closing words by Laura Lynn Bellamy. If here you have found freedom, take it with you into the world. If you have found comfort, go and share it with others. If you have dreamed dreams, help one another that they may come true. If you have known love, give some back to a bruised and hurting world. Go in peace.
Thank you so much for joining us this Sunday. I hope you have a beautiful week.